2 weeks ago, I had never seen a horror movie based on the Orthodox Jewish faith. And now, based on one of your comments, this is the second movie in the last three that I've watched that deals with this subject matter. So, isn't that kind of cool? The Vigil is a 2019 horror movie about a man hired to be a shomer to sit vigil for a local man that has nobody else. I really enjoyed this movie. Like, it had so many aesthetic touches that I just love in horror movies, like the patient camera work, the minimal lighting, the understated performances, the creepy scenes with minimal jump scares. Like, of course, there's always that fear whenever I'm watching a movie and I'm halfway through it and I'm enjoying it, that I start to worry that they aren't going to stick the landing. Like, I feel like not sticking the landing is more common in horror movies than in most other genres of film. I think it's because horror movies just really have to show all of their cards at the end and then bring everything into light, which kind of works against the core tenets of a horror movie in general. So you're really kind of working against the grain here. Now, this movie is centered around Yakov, who has recently left the Jewish Orthodox culture and is trying to adjust to being kind of on the outside, but still living in a very Jewish part of Brooklyn. Now, unlike the last movie that I did, The Offering, that centered around this same group of people, this movie is actually shot in Brooklyn, not Bulgaria, made to look like Brooklyn like that movie. Like, these apartments are a lot more New York apartments than they were. Anyway, when we first see Yakov, we see that he's already dealing with some sort of anxiety and some emotional issues. Like, he takes medication for something, and he goes to a weekly help group where he kind of talks about how trying to make ends meet now that he's sort of on his own and how difficult that can be.
I'm having to choose between medication and meals. It's not so easy.
It's actually a really nice setup for our main character, and it's played in a very grounded way, which I thought worked really well. It's not overly dramatic, and although the camera does kind of spin around the table, which is a little dramatic, but we get to hear from sort of several of the people in the group, and it's largely just there to sort of establish the setting. And one of the things I think this movie does really well is slowly dole out information about this character as the movie goes on, and we really do kind of get to know a lot about him. The first thing that we learn about Yakov is that he just got a phone for the first time, and he's trying to navigate this sort of new, less insulated world. However, while he's leaving this particular group on this night, he runs into sort of one of his former brothers within the faith who comes to him for help and offers him a job to be a shomer and sit vigil for a local man that died recently and has no family left. This man had become a recluse late in life, and his wife is now suffering from dementia, so she's not really up to the task. Now, we're told in an opening prologue, which, by the way, I've said this before, man, do I love an opening prologue. Always a plus. But we're told that a shomer is someone who has to watch the body overnight to protect it from evil spirits. Now, usually that ends up being a loved one that does it, but there are shomers that do it as an actual job. They had one of these guys lined up, but he canceled last minute, and so now they're in a bind. So this guy comes to Yakov and offers him $200 to sit with the body for 5 hours. We also see that he's still trying to get Yakov to come back into the fold. And Yakov is caught in the middle here where clearly he needs the money, but he also is trying to distance himself from this group. So immediately there is an internal conflict set up. At this point, it's midnight, and someone will come and take the body away at 5 a.m. This is where the movie settles into its main story. Now, as soon as everybody sort of leaves and he's left alone, things start happening. And they escalate in a way that tests both what he believes and also kind of his own sanity and anxiety. And I will say things do move a little fast here. And how fast things start escalating made me a little nervous that the movie was going to go too far too fast. But thankfully it does kind of strike a nice balance of pacing where it sort of lets its foot off the gas here and there, so it's not too much. Now, I'm not going to go beat by beat on this one because the story doesn't really change much as it goes forward. It's a very, very simple setup and ultimately a simple story. It's one of the things I think really works for this movie. Like, they didn't try to overcomplicate things with a lot of extra stuff and kept it to this very intimate story about this man trying to do this one job. As the story unfolds through the things that he starts to experience, we learn a little bit more about why he has PSD and anxiety, the reason for his medication, and it's sort of hinted at as to why he left the faith in the beginning. All of this is done really just to flesh out his character and to also kind of explain the motivations of the entity that he ends up encountering. Now, I want to just dive a little bit into some of the technical elements here that I really appreciated. This movie had such a great atmosphere and mood throughout the film. Now, I don't want to keep harping on The Offering and things I didn't like about it, but I want to talk a little bit about the juxtaposition between these two movies as it relates specifically to lighting. The Vigil is almost entirely lit by practicals. Now, practicals are just kind of what's called lamps or light bulbs that you see that are in the actual shot itself, as opposed to lighting that would normally just be outside the frame, which is used to mimic the lighting in frame. The use of practicals throughout this movie really gives the movie a very dark and natural feeling, which translates into a very creepy vibe. You can see the difference between these two films, and I had mentioned during that review that everything was kind of too polished and felt a little too much like a TV studio or a set. I think horror movies thrive in realistic settings, and this movie to me is proof of that. Although I should point out, I do think this one actually goes maybe a bit too far. Like, there are parts in this movie that seem to be lit by either a single lamp or a street light. And so there are times when I just couldn't see enough of what was going on. Like, thankfully, those scenes are few and they're brief, but they are there and a detriment to the film nonetheless. However, most of the film really embraces this insulated dark lighting scheme, and I think it really pays off for the mood and atmosphere. Also, they elected to shoot this movie with anamorphic lenses, which present the movie in the CinemaScope aspect ratio instead of the fairly standard sort of 16:9 that you would see on most TVs now. For a movie like this, where it ends up being like a very personal and somewhat claustrophobic, you would usually see that 16:9 so you could really get close to the actors and keep that frame relatively tight. However, I thought this was a great decision to shoot wider so that the extended field of view in the house ends up being larger, and the result is seeing more of the surrounding scene. Why that helps this movie specifically is because even when the camera is focused on Yakov, there are large sections of the frame that are showing deep areas of the house, and because of the minimal lighting, they're always either cast in shadows or complete darkness. So that, coupled with some of the lockdown longer shots, really gives this ominous feeling as your eye just can't help but wander into these dark areas and just wonder what's in them. Like, there's even a shot that they use a lot of where Yakov is sitting in a chair and you see these two lights behind him in the dark, and it almost has the look of two eyes kind of cutting through the blackness. I just believe that these are sort of the little things that I think have a real cumulative effect on the film, and something that I very much appreciated. All right, I'm going to get into the end of this movie, so if you want to avoid spoilers, just skip this part. Ultimately, Yakov hears about this demon or evil spirit that has latched onto this man due to something that he did during the war getting out of Europe, and it ended up staying with him until his dying day, feeding on his pain. So this evil spirit was the reason why the man had driven his children away and had become a recluse in the first place. Now with his death, the demon will seek out a new host, and if you allow it to attach itself to you, it's going to be there for the rest of your life, just slowly eating away at you. And the thing this thing is most attracted to is pain. Now, unfortunately, most of all this information is kind of told in one expository dump when Yakov is led downstairs by a vision and comes across a video that the old man had made before his death. I'm a little disappointed at this. Like, as I think the idea of a video kind of laying it all out felt a little too convenient, I think since the wife knew about all this, it would have been better suited if she kind of explained it. Because there's some really good scenes between the two of them already, and so this could have been told during some of those. I just felt the video was just a little too easy, and one of the few missteps of the film. Also, speaking of the wife, like, she was supposed to have dementia, but that never really plays a part in this as the story goes on. Like, you don't really notice any of that. Anyway, we find out that Yakov's emotional troubles is specifically tied to his little brother, who was actually killed in front of him on the street. And Yakov feels very, very guilty that he didn't do enough to try and save him. And this guilt has been haunting him ever since. This also happens to be the type of pain that the demon is really honing in on and why it is pursuing him as a possible host going forward. So if Yakov doesn't stop this demon by first light, he'll be stuck with it forever, just like the old man was. Thankfully, once he kind of fully comes to accept this and accept kind of what he did and how he played into it and grieve for his brother, he's able to sort of face down the demon in a final confrontation in order to get rid of it. This was another part I was kind of slightly disappointed at. I felt this resolution, although played beautifully by him and certainly masterfully shot with a lot of sort of symbolism in the imagery, I felt was maybe a bit too easy. Like, he basically just kind of walks up to this demon and burns him. And I think it was supposed to be more of an internal struggle, but since it ended up being sort of an external action, I wish there was some sort of external obstacles in the way. It just felt a little too quick. The last thing I want to touch on with the ending is one of the things I think people who make horror movies sometimes forget when it comes to endings is they tend to focus on the tropes, the darkness, the final scares, and ending the movie with a stinger, right? A ghost jumping at the screen, the killer opening its eyes before the credits, always leaning into that sort of downbeat scenario to get their audience on edge at the end. But a lot of times I think they forget that some of the best horror movies can have some of the most beautiful and optimistic endings and allow a real catharsis for the character to shine through. Like, I really liked at the end of this movie how you feel like Yakov went through something substantial and then came out on the other side better for it. I mean, I know this is sort of character arc 101, but I just felt like it was a great journey that he went on, and how this story ends for him ended up being rather beautiful. At the end of the day, this is such a simple story, but that's not a bad thing at all. Simple can be very effective. There were moments where I thought it was gonna try and overcomplicate things, but thankfully it kept on the path pretty well. This movie looks fantastic and sets up a wonderful atmosphere with some real creepy vibes. I thought the scares got maybe a little too cute with some of the phone stuff that they kind of implement, but in the end it all works really well as the motivation of the demon that's involved. Stellar acting all around, and it really grounded the movie in a sense of realism that I thought brought it home well. I'd give this movie an A-, but let me know what you think.